She's not with me. Colin Hewitt said it so easily, barely pausing between sips of his scotch, and those 4 words reached Phoebe Greer from 3 feet away like a slap delivered in slow motion. She had been standing just behind his left shoulder in the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for tonight, the one she'd spent 40 minutes asking the mirror whether it looked all right. She had driven to the old gate with Colin's hand on the gear shift, listening to him rehearse the names of the partners he needed to impress. She had believed, genuinely believed, that tonight was the night he would finally say it out loud, that she was his. Instead, his senior partner, Mr. Havelock, had leaned across the white-clothed table with polite interest and asked, "And who is this lovely lady?" "She's not with me," Colin said. "She's the bookkeeper here." A short silence followed, the kind that fills a room faster than sound. Phoebe didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, and she watched the ice in Colin's tumbler settle as though nothing of consequence had just occurred. Across the table, 2 junior associates exchanged a glance they tried to disguise as adjusting their napkins. Mr. Havelock blinked once and smoothly returned his attention to the breadbasket. She had been introduced as furniture. And Colin, 4 years, 2 shared apartments, a promise he'd made standing in her kitchen one Sunday morning. Colin was already gesturing toward the woman 2 seats down. Avery, he'd called her, his colleague, tall, angular, composure like lacquered wood. "Actually," Colin said, his voice warming into the register Phoebe recognized as performance, "I did have an announcement." He reached into his jacket pocket. Phoebe understood before the small velvet box appeared on the tablecloth. The room was full of noise, cutlery, low conversation, the soft percussion of a jazz trio near the east wall, but all of it receded into a pressurized quiet that only Phoebe seemed to be inside. She watched Colin open the box. She watched him look at Avery with the particular expression he used when he wanted to appear unrehearsed. She watched Avery's hand go to her mouth in performed surprise. No one looked at Phoebe. That was almost worse, the way the moment simply closed around her, neat as a scar. She set her wine glass on the nearest surface, which happened to be an empty tray stand near the wall. She wasn't sure when her legs had carried her there. She wasn't sure of much, except that the exit was 15 meters away, and she couldn't decide if walking toward it would make her more invisible or less. "You look like you're deciding whether to leave or wait to become part of the wallpaper." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who chose every word with deliberate economy. Phoebe turned. She had worked at the Aldgate for 14 months. In that time, she had occupied a small office off the second landing, reconciled accounts that didn't always balance in ways she'd learned not to think about too carefully, and made it her practice to know every employee by name and preferred coffee order. She was good at existing quietly in spaces. She had made an art of it. She had seen the man who now stood beside her exactly twice. Once in the parking garage, when he had arrived in a black SUV, with 2 men who walked like they were counting exits. Once from a window, when he had stood outside the service entrance, talking to the head chef in a conversation that ended with the chef nodding and not speaking again for the rest of the afternoon. The staff called him Mr. Kane. They called him this the way people referred to the weather, as something that simply was, with no expectation of negotiation. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance. Dark suit, open collar. A jaw that looked like it had been assembled with function rather than beauty in mind. His eyes, when they found hers, were a grey that reminded her of November sky over the lake. Not empty, but offering very little. "Rise Kane," he said. Not an introduction exactly, more like a fact being confirmed. "I know," Phoebe said, and immediately felt foolish for it. He didn't react. His gaze moved briefly to the table across the room, where applause had begun, brief, polite, meaningless, and then returned to her. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. She almost laughed. "I don't think I was ever really here." A pause. He seemed to turn this over without displaying any particular opinion about it. "Come," he said simply, and turned toward the corridor that led to the restaurant's private rear courtyard. She followed him. She wasn't sure why, possibly because every alternative felt worse. The courtyard was empty at this hour, cut off from the dining room noise by a heavy door and a short hallway that smelled of cedar and cold stone. 2 chairs sat beside a low planter of dormant rosemary. He gestured at them without looking back, and she sat, still holding her handbag against her body like a small shield. He remained standing, angled toward the courtyard entrance, as though part of his attention was permanently elsewhere. "You don't have to stay out here," she said, after the silence had stretched long enough to become a presence of its own. "I'm fine." "You're not." She stopped. It was humiliating, not dangerous. "I'm aware of the difference." She looked at him. He was still facing the doorway, but she got the sense that very little escaped him, regardless of where his eyes pointed. "Did you know?" she asked because she suddenly needed to. "Before tonight, did anyone here know what he was planning?" "No. He comes here twice a month." "I know. We've been together 4 years." She said it to the courtyard. I was certain he was going to." She exhaled slowly. "I bought this dress specifically." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The dress is fine." It was such a spare comfort, so devoid of elaboration, that she almost believed it. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, mostly to redirect herself. 14 years. "And you've owned the building for longer. You're not very forthcoming." The corner of his mouth shifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it marked the possibility of one. "You're the bookkeeper," he said. "Yes. You've been reconciling the accounts since October last year. 14 months, yes." He turned then and looked at her directly. "You've never asked about the columns that don't reconcile." She met his eyes. "That's a complicated subject." "It is. And it wasn't why I took the job." "Why did you?" She looked at the rosemary. "Because the previous bookkeeper left on short notice, and I needed something stable. And because," she paused, "the kitchen staff here are treated well. That mattered to me." He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought she'd said something strange. "That was the thing I noticed first," he said. She frowned. "What was?" "The memo you left when the summer staff came on. In June." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a small folded square of paper, cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges. She recognized it immediately. It was a note she'd left in the staff kitchen, 5 lines long, in her particular close handwriting. "All seasonal staff, please help yourselves to the top shelf in the walk-in. It's stocked with drinks and snacks for your break. You're all working long hours and it matters. P. Greer, accounts." She'd done it on her own initiative, paid for the supplies out of pocket, and had genuinely forgotten about it within a week. "You kept that," she said. "I did." She didn't have a word. "Unusual," he offered. I was going to say strange. "That also works." She stared at the paper. The fold lines were soft, like it had been opened and refolded more than once. "You don't even know me," she said. "Not really. I know how you treat people when there's no reason to impress them." He placed the note back inside his jacket. "That's the part that doesn't change." The door from the corridor opened, and a young server stepped out, saw them, and took a quiet step backward. "Sorry, Mr. Kane, Miss Greer, I didn't realize." "It's all right, Dan," Phoebe said before Reese could respond. "You're not interrupting. How much longer is your shift?" "Till close," the server said. "Midnight. There's leftover cheesecake from the private dining room. Make sure the back of house gets some before it's cleared." Yes, thank you, Miss Greer." He retreated back inside. When she looked back at Rhys, his expression hadn't changed. But something in the quality of his stillness had shifted, the way weather shifts before anyone thinks to check the forecast. "I do that everywhere I work," she said, mildly defensive. "It's not a personality, it's just people work hard." "I know," he said. "You've done it here for 14 months. You've been watching that long. Observing. The distinction being." He looked at her steadily. Watching implies waiting for something to go wrong. 3 weeks after that evening, Colin called. Phoebe was in the middle of reconciling a variance in the accounts payable file when her phone lit up on the desk beside her. She looked at his name for 4 rings, then set the phone face down and returned to the spreadsheet. She hadn't cried, which surprised her. She had expected tears, the kind she'd learned to save for the shower, when no one was around to suggest she was being too sensitive. Instead, she'd felt something more like the peculiar clarity that follows a long fever. Flat and rinsed out and oddly honest. She had organized 4 years of her life around a man who had been quietly, consistently diminishing her. Not cruelly, not with raised voices, with small calibrations, suggesting she order the salad, wondering aloud whether that color really worked for her body type. Changing the subject when she talked about promotions at work, introducing her to his colleagues as a friend rather than his girlfriend until she'd stopped expecting anything different. She hadn't noticed the pattern until it was already part of her architecture. "Rhys didn't call," he texted once 3 days after the courtyard. "The accounts for March are ready for your review. Also, the kitchen staff liked the cheesecake." She had looked at that message for a long time. She texted back, "Dan told me." He replied, "Good." That was it. But he started leaving a coffee on the corner of her desk on the mornings she came in early. No note, dark roast, precisely the way she drank it, which she had never told him. She didn't mention it, neither did he. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed in the way that proximity creates. Brief conversations in the corridor, a shared table in the kitchen when the dining room was closed for repairs. One afternoon when a supplier dispute required her to explain 3 months of discrepancies to a very unhappy contact, and Rhys sat 2 chairs away, reading correspondence and offered single, precise answers when the contact escalated. He didn't take over. He simply ensured no one in the room forgot which side of the table held the authority. Afterward, she told him, "You didn't need to stay for that." "I know," he said. The man was unpleasant. He was. You could have had him removed immediately. "I could have." He closed his folder. "You were handling it." She looked at him. "That's... Why does that make me more uncomfortable than if you'd just stepped in?" "Because you're not accustomed to being trusted," he said, without particular emphasis, as though stating the boiling point of water. She had no response to that. She wasn't sure she was meant to. Colin came back in April. He showed up at the Aldgate on a Thursday evening, during the private dining hour, wearing the expression he deployed when he was attempting sincerity. Phoebe was in the corridor reviewing a delivery manifest when she heard her name and turned to find him standing in the entrance hall, looking both deliberate and slightly miscalculated. "I thought we should talk," he said. "We don't need to," she said. "Phoebe." He said her name in the soft, weighted way that had once made her feel seen and now felt like a hand on her shoulder she hadn't invited. "What happened at dinner? I was a coward. I know that." "You were clear," she corrected. "You were very clear." "I was wrong." He took a step forward. "Avery and I, it was a mistake. I've been thinking about us and I." "Colin!" "I know I hurt you. I want to make it right." She looked at him with a kind of exhausted precision. She recognized now, and this was the thing that had clarified slowly over the past weeks like a photograph developing, that he wasn't here because he missed her. He was here because he had spent 3 weeks learning what it meant that Phoebe Greer worked closely with Rhys Kane, and what Rhys Kane represented in this city. She could see it in the particular quality of his humility, which was less like remorse, and more like a business case with a human face on it. "You told Mr. Havelock I was the bookkeeper," she said. "I know. You planned to announce an engagement to another woman at the table I was sitting at. You kept it from me long enough that I genuinely believed tonight was going to be." She stopped herself. "It doesn't matter what I believed. It does matter." "No." She kept her voice level, but this time she didn't soften it at the edges the way she usually did. The old habit of making her own positions easier to swallow for everyone else in the room. "It doesn't matter to this conversation, because this conversation doesn't have a second half." He reached out and put his hand on her wrist, not roughly, just the pressure of someone who was accustomed to being the one who decided when exchanges concluded. She looked down at his hand. "Let go." The voice came from the doorway to the west corridor. 2 words, delivered so quietly, they might have been mistaken for a maintenance instruction. Rhys stood in the doorframe with his jacket open and his hands at his sides. He looked at Colin the way people look at a structural problem, assessing, not alarmed. Colin released her wrist. "This is a private conversation," Colin said. "It's my building," Rhys replied. "I'm asking to speak with." "You've spoken." Rhys crossed the hall in measured steps and positioned himself at Phoebe's side. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. She noted this. She thought she understood it. "She gave you an answer." Colin's jaw worked. He looked from Rhys to Phoebe and back again, making calculations that were visible in the way his posture shifted. "You don't know what we were to each other," Colin said. "I know what you were to her," Rhys said. "And I know what you're doing here." "I came to apologize." "No," Rhys said. "You came to see if the apology was worth more than it cost." The hall was very quiet. Phoebe watched Colin's expression move through several rooms. Indignation, then recalibration, then a version of dignity that didn't fit the situation, and he knew it. "You'll regret this," he said to her. The old line, the one she'd heard before when she'd disagreed with something small, when she'd declined to apologize for something she hadn't done. It had always worked, or nearly worked, because she'd always been afraid he was right. She looked at him now. "Colin," she said, keeping her voice even, "you didn't lose me at that dinner table. You showed me, in front of the whole room, exactly who you'd decided I was." She let that settle. "I spent 4 years believing that version of myself. I'm not going to spend another 4 minutes on it." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Then he straightened his jacket, nodded once at nothing in particular, and left. The entrance hall seemed to recalibrate itself in his absence. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Phoebe exhaled, long, slow, like something that had been held tightly for a very long time. "He's going to tell people," she said. "About me. About." She made a small gesture toward Rhys that she hoped communicated the general situation without requiring elaboration. "He won't," Rhys said, simply enough that she believed him. She pressed her back against the wall and tilted her head upward, looking at the pressed tin ceiling that some long-ago version of this building had installed and no subsequent owner had ever replaced. She had always liked that ceiling. It was impractical and beautiful, and no one ever commented on it. "I spent 4 years adjusting," she said to it, "making myself smaller, not literally, although he had opinions about that, too." A humorless breath. "I stopped ordering what I wanted at restaurants. I started running every morning because he said it would be good for me, and I kept running because somewhere along the way, I forgot whose idea it was. I apologized before he finished sentences. I thought that was what love looked like when it got practical. She wasn't speaking to Reese exactly. She was saying things she had assembled in the quiet weeks since the dinner and hadn't yet said aloud to anyone. He never shouted, she continued. That's the part no one outside would understand. He was always so measured, so thoughtful sounding. She finally looked at Reese. I'm 29 years old, and I genuinely thought I was lucky that someone like him had chosen someone like me. Reese was watching her with that same characteristic stillness. Someone like you, he repeated. You know what I mean. I know what he taught you to mean. He paused. It's not the same thing. She opened her mouth, closed it. You think you were lucky, he said, because he was successful and presentable, and because he stayed for 4 years despite. He didn't finish. Despite being embarrassed by me, she said. Despite not deserving you, Reese said. The correction was quiet and definite, and she felt it move through her like cold water on a hot afternoon. You don't need to say that. I don't say things I don't mean. She had noticed this. 14 months of working in proximity to him, and she had catalogued this about him. He did not deploy words for social maintenance. When he said something, it had already passed through whatever process he used to decide what was worth the air. Why did you keep the memo? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I'd been running this building for 20 years, he said. And in that time I've seen a great many people decide that the ones who move dishes and restock linen and hold doors open are not worth the effort of acknowledgement. He looked at her. You walked in 14 months ago and learned everyone's name in the first 2 weeks. You know Dan, for it's to be called Dan after 8 p.m. You know the sommelier's daughter just started at U of T. You know the woman who manages the coat check takes the 29 bus and has been late 3 times because of construction on Dufferin. A pause. You know these things because you asked, not for any reason, just because you thought it mattered that someone did. She didn't speak. The memo reminded me that people like that are rarer than they believe they are. He met her eyes. I didn't want to lose track of it. She pressed her lips together against something that was threatening to become tears. Not the ugly kind from the night of the dinner, when she'd sat in her car in the parking garage and shaken without sound until she was emptied out. Something quieter than that. Something that felt less like grief and more like a window being opened in a room that had been shut all winter. I don't know what to do with you, she said honestly. You don't have to do anything, he said. I'm not asking you to. Then, what are you asking? He was quiet long enough that the question seemed to settle between them like something with weight. I'm asking, he said finally, whether you'd like to have dinner, here or somewhere else, without accounting spreadsheets as an excuse. She stared at him. She searched for the right word. That's very normal. I'm capable of normal. I had genuine doubts. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but in the same territory. Is that a yes? He asked. She thought about the 4 years she'd spent, making herself an acceptable size, in every sense of the word, for a man who had been planning to announce an engagement to someone else at the same table she was standing at. She thought about a folded piece of cream paper that had spent months in the inside pocket of a jacket belonging to a man who said less than almost anyone she'd met, and meant more with every word he chose. It's a yes, she said. 8 months later, the evening light came through the tall west windows at the St. Lawrence Market, at the particular angle that turned everything briefly golden. Phoebe was at a table near the window, reviewing a contract, her own this time, not the Aldgate's, for a small consultancy she had started in January. She was describing her pricing structure to a potential client on the phone, using the voice she'd had to grow back, the one that didn't apologize ahead of itself, or make itself smaller before anyone had even asked. Across the market, she could see a small girl struggling to carry a tray of pastries for a vendor stall. Before she could act on the impulse, Reese, who had been standing 2 tables away, reading something on his phone, crossed the floor without hurrying, took the tray, and held it at a height the girl could manage while she repositioned her grip. He did this without looking up from his phone. He did it the way she thanked servers by name, not for an audience, just because it needed doing. She ended her call. She watched him return the tray, say something brief to the vendor, and turn back to find her already looking at him. He crossed to the table and sat. "You saw that," he said. "I did. Don't read into it." "Too late," she said. "Much too late." He looked at her with the November grey of his eyes, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was what she'd been missing, the whole time she'd spent trying to be less. Someone who didn't need her to be smaller. Someone who'd been keeping a folded piece of paper in his jacket and waiting, not for her to change, but for her to understand that she never needed to. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over without hesitation and held hers. Outside, Toronto went on the way cities do, enormous and indifferent and full of ordinary people, carrying trays and taking buses and working late, quietly, making the whole structure hold together. Phoebe Greer had always been one of them. She just hadn't known until now that someone had been watching the whole time and found her worth every minute of it.